Uh, it is a real pleasure to present as a result, I would say very preliminary result of our work together with my brilliant colleagues, Maryna Sydorova from the University of Bern and also Aleksandra Urman from the University of Zurich. And just a short disclaimer, I am slightly ill right now, so bear with me. I might say a couple of things which might not make sense, but I will try to kind of minimize the presence of this nonsensical things. So, as Mia said, pretty much what we are trying to do in this specific project is actually conduct a longitudinal analysis of Holocaust-related content in Twitter sphere and specifically in the Russian Twitter sphere. Now, after a brilliant presentation of Robert, I'm really glad that I do not necessarily need to go through a lot of points and a lot of assumptions. Robert really beautifully covered many of them, so it definitely isn't my work. Still, I would really like to start by briefly touching some of the, I would say, key points behind what we are doing and key assumptions that we are having. So the first point is relates to the whole idea of the history-related content on social media. So pretty much I think that now it becomes more or less of a consensus that social media enable quite a new possibilities, both for institutions who dealing with the past, but also for the individuals to interact and engage with this past. Why it is so? Pretty much because social media definitely make it much easier to produce content, including content which deals with the history, which refers to the history, unfortunately sometimes also destroys the history. And it actually facilitates new forms of reflecting on the past as well as grassroots practices, including, for instance, internet memes, which is also something that we're working together with colleagues. And I'm so glad also to see how Robert beautifully works with them. What is also interesting about the role of social media and historical content right now is that it definitely gives more possibilities for the institutions to reach new audiences and also promote the already existing memory practices. But also the same factors also facilitate, unfortunately, appropriation and instrumentalization of the past, which might be a problem, especially in the certain context, as you can guess. And pretty much one of the major challenges that we actually try to address in this project together with the colleagues is this question of how we can actually study the different uses of history-related content on social media, especially when we're dealing with relatively large data sets. And trust me, the data set that I would be talking today is really not that large, but they're definitely way larger data sets. So what is our case study that we actually wanted to do here? So pretty much, as I already noted, we are really interested in how we can analyze a large volume of social media data, which dealing with the past. And specifically, we wanted here to look at the Holocaust-related content in the Russian Twitter sphere from 2008 to 2022. Why we're interested in the Holocaust? Well, I would say it's a relatively obvious example. It is really one of the most mediatized historical events. It's also one of the historical events which gets to be the most commonly discussed on the social media. And also, unfortunately, it is also the event which is intensively instrumentalized in different parts of the world. While we're looking on the Twitter, again, as you can guess, because of the available API, unfortunately, it is really the reason why we're having so much studies on Twitter and not that much studies on the other type of social media platforms. We'll actually see if this kind of bias would actually become corrected in the upcoming years. Now, as Elon actually owns the Twitter, I kind of a bit skeptical that the open API would stay with us for long, but we will see. And then Twitter also provides relatively uniform content form-wise, which on the one hand is actually beneficial for the quantitative approaches. On the other hand, it's not that beneficial considering the specific type of content that we're having on Twitter, so very short texts, which are often very difficult to analyze for many reasons. And finally, Twitter is quite a prominent role of memory platform, which is also makes sense to analyze in this context. And finally, why Russia? Well, so definitely reasons. First of all, Russia is really a prominent fractured memory regime with a distinct set of online memory practices, some of them quite, I would say, beneficial and actually trying to empower the grassroots activists. Some of them are highly problematic and actually empowering the Kremlin narratives. And finally, we also know that there is both distinct practices of Holocaust memory in Russia, as well as quite intense instrumentalization of the Holocaust memory, especially in the context of the ongoing horrible war against Ukraine, which was actually motivated and justified by the references to the Holocaust. Okay, we just need to kill all the Ukrainian nation, and then we're happily living thereafter. So what exactly do we want to do? We wanted to compare the performance of several approaches for processing the large volume of social media data, which deals with historical information, namely information about the Holocaust. And specifically, we focus on the non-supervised approaches. So as Robert noted, we definitely have non-supervised approaches. We have supervised approaches. The main problem with the supervised approaches that you actually need quite some training data, which you need to manually label, and then you actually need to train and deploy your model, which honestly quite some headache. Pretty much, it is also work in progress. So for now, we look just at two approaches, the bigram LDA and also by topic. And by topic, I would say, is relatively close to what Robert was talking, because by topic is also based on the idea of the transformer models, the deep learning. And pretty much we also still have to think about the good set of metrics to actually compare the performance of those two models, because actually following, I would say, different logic in some cases. So if you have brilliant ideas about what kind of set of metrics we might use, and definitely shoot to me, I definitely would love your ideas. And pretty much for now, we just based some initial observations based on the qualitative assessment of the data samples to see how different or how similar are the results that we are getting. Now, just a super short literature review. So what we know about the historical content on Twitter, we definitely know quite some things. Most of the research, as we argue, is actually tending to focus on the qualitative approach to the content analysis of Twitter data, as well as network analysis. There are definitely some very interesting observations there. As far as we know, there are only a few studies which focus on more computational approaches to the content analysis. You can guess that Collaborate is one of those. Also, there are some interesting studies by Sumikawa and Yatoft. However, what we argue is that it definitely would help to actually look more on the potential of such approaches, both because they're promising approaches, but also I very much believe that we actually can benefit from providing more humanities-oriented critique of these approaches to actually help them to make better. And also because we actually argue that such approaches are important for helping us to understand the history-related online practices in non-Western contexts, which are still so far, at least in our opinion, is really not that much studied. And we definitely also recognize that qualitative techniques such as manual content analysis, close reading are super valuable and super important. But what we're also arguing is that they're quite subjected to the sampling bias, in particular for really large data sets, when it's really very hard to construct a representative sample of the data which can be manually coded, and also having limitations for investigating the implications of the digital turn in the context of social media and the uses of history. So what we did in very practical terms was data collection. As you can guess, we use Twitter API for academic research to collect data, which is really nice tool. At least for now, it's still a nice tool. Specifically in summer, autumn 2022, we retrieved all unique tweets. So we actually didn't include retweets or replies, only basically unique publications on the Twitter on the highest level, which contains the term Holocaust, namely Holocaust in Russian. And we collected the data for the period from January 2008 to the October 2022. And altogether, as you see, our sample is really not that big of a data. It's just around 70,000 tweets, which also tells you something about the intensity of actually discussing Holocaust in the Russian Twitter sphere. Of course, noting also the possibility that there are definitely other keywords that are used in this case. We also kind of recognize the potential problem with the ambiguity, because we know that the same spelling for the Holocaust is in Bulgarian as in Russian, but we basically conducted a very quick manual examination, which has suggested that almost all tweets are in the Russian. We decided not to rely on kind of built-in Twitter language detector, because in early research we found that it's highly problematic, especially for the Eastern European languages. And also our manual examination here also suggested that it would be too problematic to actually rely on. What we did in terms of the data analysis, as I said, we used two unsupervised approaches for now, LDA and by topic, and we applied it to 3 samples of data, which we actually divided based on the temporal principle. So we basically created a sample of data for the 2008-2013, the 2014-2019, and 2020-2022. If you're actually familiar with what's happening at Eastern Europe, you can actually guess one of the principles here. So we were really interested if actually these periods correspond to the increased instrumentalization of the reference to the Holocaust, both in relation to the war in Ukraine, but also, for instance, in relation to the COVID pandemic, which was definitely the case when Holocaust memory was actually again used by the kind of as a form of appropriation to kind of empower the COVID deniers. So in terms of the LDA, as I guess some people here know, it's a very classic machine learning approach, really very commonly used, but also I would say sometimes problematic, especially for the short texts. And basically the idea of the LDA is that you can actually manually identify the varying n of optimal topics based on the topic coherence. By topic is kind of more complicated and very less transparent. It's really a recent approach which utilizes transformer models. It shows high performance across different types of data and topics. It's also quite language agnostic, so no preprocessing required. I might not necessarily fully agree with this one. Kind of Sasha was responsible for doing the byte topic. We might actually talk a bit more about how we implemented this one. But for now, we kind of assume that it's language agnostic. And also it relies on the self-deterministic algorithm in order to detect the optimal topic number, unlike LDA. And basically just based on the assigning the specific minimal number of documents per topic, and we used 100 documents for our case study. And additionally, we used manually labeled subsamples of 30 tweets for each of time-based samples to compare with the performance of unsupervised approaches. Now it's time for some nice pictures, and also not very understandable pictures, as usually with topic modeling. So basically what you can see on the top is the LDA model, and what you can actually see on the bottom is byte topic. There are definitely a lot of colorful lines, so I will just go relatively quickly through those and kind of pinpoint what we found the most interesting. So first of all, we found that there is definitely some similarities in terms of the topics which I identified. Specifically, one interesting similarity relates to the topic about the glue for the wallpaper, which probably really sounds super counterintuitive about how it is related to the Holocaust. It is actually a name of the documentary about the lack of the knowledge about the Holocaust in Russia. I think that Alisa might actually know this one. If you have any questions, just ask me. But basically, this kind of topic, which was actually related to the media test event, which was actually related to the discussion of this specific movie, is actually present and identified by both topic modeling approaches. In other cases, what we also see is that byte topic identifies a few more media test events. For instance, Iran president recognized. This actually relates to one of the rare recognition on the side of Iran that the Holocaust actually happened. Then there is some discussions of the Miss Holocaust Israel competition, which is another media test event. Interestingly, this kind of events actually not necessarily noticed by the LDA. What we also see is there is some potentially problematic indicators of potentially problematic contents. For instance, the cheers first for the Holocaust. As you can guess, it's probably something related to the hate speech. Manual content actually suggests that yes, it is pretty much related to the hate speech. It's basically the call, okay, let's cheer for the Holocaust. It's such a nice time. It's highly problematic, as you can guess. And pretty much I would say it is it. Now, what we're actually seeing when we're looking for the second period, and the first set of images was to the 2008-2013. Now we are looking for the results for the 2014-2019. What you find quite interesting is that unlike the previous period, we definitely have higher presence of the topics dealing with the Russia, with the Putin. And I think that for the byte, we're also having one topic which is definitely related to the Ukraine, which is kind of summarized by the keywords Lithuania, Tymoshenko, the former Ukrainian politician, Baltic Wall and massacre. So basically, this idea of actually using Holocaust to actually kind of further demonize the Ukraine, and especially the wartime Ukraine. Pretty much in the case of LDA, we also seeing similar, I would say, trends. What we're also definitely observing is quite some attention, for instance, to the Holocaust survivors. But this point about instrumentalization, which actually starts appearing after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we found probably one of the most interesting. And then we're actually looking on the data for 2020, 2022, then we see that there is something quite problematic with our LDA performance. I definitely would need to look more into the code of what is happening. But basically, I would say that the definition of the topics really probably went relatively wrong. But even still, we see that there is definitely some mentions of what we actually interpret as references to the instrumentalization of the Holocaust memory, again, references to the Russia, Putin, Hitler, and so on and so forth. Again, same we actually observing for the byte topic. What I also find pretty interesting in the case of the byte topic, which is another kind of additional benefit of this specific topic modeling approach, it also shows kind of the dynamics. And what I find super interesting is that unlike previous periods, we're also seeing very distinct peaks around the, I would say, the Auschwitz commemoration day in January, which is something that we didn't necessarily observe for the earlier period, which might also suggest some, I would say, forms of the formalization of the actually Twitter-based commemoration. And again, there is quite strong prevalence, I would say, of references to the instrumentalization. Now, it is all wonderful and shiny, but what we're actually seeing, if you're comparing it with the actual manual coding of the very short samples of the data. So as you can see, we went here for the relatively, I would say, intuitive categories. the presence of denialism, the reference to the historical facts, the tweets which communicate hate speech, the tweets which actually try to instrumentalize the history, tweets focused on commemoration. And what we can definitely observe is, again, something that we would expect is that, for instance, instrumentalization definitely rises through the period. What we found pretty interesting based on this relatively short qualitative exercise that we, for instance, didn't observe almost any mentions of the Holocaust in relation to the COVID protests. So we know that there was definitely a sink in Russia, unfortunately, but interestingly on Twitter, we do not necessarily see it, which might actually be attributed to the relatively good job in filtering and cleaning this kind of content that Twitter was doing. Same I would probably say is also explains the relatively low presence of denialism. Even while based again on the topic models, we might actually expect slightly more presence of denialism and hate speech, which again kind of raises this question of what we are seeing depending on the method. Now, what kind of conclusions can be arrived? And then I would actually finally shut up. So we observed a number of agreements between LDA and by topic, which we find interesting. With the latter definitely enabling more granularity as well as better examination of topic dynamics, so pretty much what Robert was saying. The more modern is the approach, the more data it actually used to be trained and then redeployed for a specific task, and it's likely the better it actually performs. Unfortunately, the usual return back is the lack of transparency. Main observations about the Russian Twitter sphere are based on this kind of longitudinal analysis approach that we can make is a strong presence of some mediatist events, probably expected based on what we are knowing about digital memory. Quite some survivor-related discussions, something that we did not necessarily expect, something that we found relatively interesting. Definitely, probably more trivialization, sometimes, unfortunately, very dangerously close to the hate speech in the two first periods, and definitely probably high instrumentalization for the last two periods in relation to the war in Ukraine. What we also found quite interesting is, as I already noted, we didn't really observe much visibility of instrumentalization of Holocaust memory in the context of COVID. We expected to see it. It actually didn't happen. And again, main issue that we observe is a limited interpretability of many topics models. So as you see, there's really like a short vectors of the keywords, which unfortunately you do not necessarily able to interpret that lightly, especially if you necessarily do not have a very rich imagination. And if you actually have a very rich imagination, there's always a question of how much you actually see it on the data and how much you actually see it in your imagination, which might be a problem. And we also find that it's relatively hard to detect more argument-based issues based on the topic modeling. For instance, denial of hate speech, because really when basic arguments condense to very short vectors, it's really hard to interpret, okay, might it be hate speech, might it be just a bad joke, might it be just a, I would say, relatively random combination of words. What does it mean in terms of choosing the best methods for the large history-related datasets? Okay, bad news, there is still not a silver bullet. As really a computational person, I would really love to tell you, okay, guys, use only quantitative methods. They're so cool, they're so wonderful. I would not do this. It would really be bad advice for you to do. Pretty much what we definitely see good about the topic modeling and quantitative approaches in general, that even in the fast cook format, they enable fast processing of data, which is really cool, but their interpretation is still relatively limited or time consuming, because you can definitely do quite good work with interpretation, for instance, with connecting the most representative tweets or the most representative text to the specific topics, but it actually would require quite substantial time, which is not necessarily would be that less time compared with the manual examination, at least what we like. By contrast, qualitative approaches are definitely good. They definitely provide you some possibilities for the close reading, but unfortunately, they definitely seem to miss quite some events as well as the patterns which are identified by the topic models, unless N becomes large enough, and probably in our specific case study, N can become large enough relatively easy. But if you actually, for instance, would like to look on the English Twitter sphere and actually having, I would say, I don't know, probably around 50 million of tweets, I still need to double check our data collection. Getting the feasible enough large and probably wouldn't be really realistic. We're also still struggling with some difficulties with comparing by topic and LDA. Again, if you have wonderful ideas, just tell us. I would really appreciate some advice. But generally, the by topic looks more robust. The price transformer is really good. And for the future, what we definitely want to do is to actually use more models to compare and also much more fine tuning to make. as well as we'll think more about the comparison strategies. And pretty much I would say that eventually the conclusion would, again, similar to what Robert was noted, really the choice of the approach really depends on the level of focus of the analysis. So if you really want to get a fast overview of the data, then yeah, definitely go for the topic modeling. If you're interested in relatively, I would say, fine-tuned questions, such for instance, what is really the arguments which are used to instrumentalize the past? What is really the way the hate speech or denialism constructed? I really would not believe that quantitative approaches unfortunately would be the way to go, maybe like in 5 or 10 years, but I still have some doubts. This is it. Thank you very much.